So let's say you get in a car accident. Well, now you can't just choose from a bunch of generic parts because repair shops have to use patented parts from the manufacturer. And obviously these aren't cheap, especially for you as a consumer. These design patents are a lot easier to obtain than traditional patents for inventions. And they are technically only supposed to be limited to ornamental items that have a specific appearance. But once you start allowing component parts to be patented, like the grille of a Ford Focus, you're really starting to stretch that definition. And that's exactly what car companies are doing today. By doing this, companies are creating a profitable patent-enforced monopoly in aftermarket replacement parts. Consumers are left with little or no choice. And these design patents last for 14 years, which is basically the life of your car, so to speak, if you consider the average American keeps his car for 12 years. Just look at the stats. Since 2005, design patents issued on collision repair parts have more than doubled. So this is actually a trend in the industry. But this all really started back in 2008. Ford obtained patents for several collision repair parts for the 2004 F-150. That included patents for things like grills, head and tail lamps, side view mirrors, and bumpers. Soon after, Keystone Automotive Industries and a few other companies wanted to import alternative parts from overseas factories. They certainly tried, but then Ford filed an official complaint against them with the International Trade Commission. Ford alleged patent infringement. Later that same year, ITC took Ford's side on 7 of the patents, and then they barred the importation of any competing replacements into the U.S. Ultimately, both parties agreed to reach a settlement in the matter, but this gave further impetus to the car industry that patents for replacements would hold up to legal scrutiny. When courts find that a patent has been infringed, the patent owner is entitled to all the gross profits from that product's sale. That's regardless of whether the design feature played any role at all in a consumer's decision. So, guess the top 3 companies that have the most patents? Well, it's Ford, Toyota, and Honda. Just to put the sheer magnitude of that into perspective, consider this. The car industry generates the 3rd most patents filings of any business sector. The only 2 companies who generate more patent filings are those in computing and telecommunications. But it's not just the car industry. There are other industries that are also infamous for using design patents to kill the market for replacement parts. Think of things like even razors and ink cartridges. We all know these products are also notorious for relatively high prices. Everyone knows that original equipment manufacturer or OEM parts are a lot more expensive than generic ones. The American Insurance Association estimated that competing generic replacement parts are typically 34 to 83% less expensive. It's estimated generic parts could save consumers up to $2.4 billion every year. But automakers' monopoly on design parts is ever more on the rise. To be honest, most consumers don't always recognize the difference in car parts. But either way, their insurers pick up the tab, and consumers feel it eventually in higher car insurance premiums. Today, if this patented practice were applied to every car part, it's estimated to cost insurers an extra $1.5 billion per year. Automakers claim that OEM replacement parts are more reliable. But what's the truth? Opponents claim that a lot of the parts come off the same exact assembly lines and that the only thing that's different is one's labeled OEM and the other isn't. But if you're thinking that companies like Ford actually create these OEM parts, that's not necessarily the case. These big car companies just hold profitability patents on parts. Actually, it's independent suppliers that manufacture the majority of the car's parts and internal systems these days. Did you know that the top 10 suppliers capture 60% of the total revenue? And then there's planned obsolescence. Basically, this is a strategy whereby a company purposely manufactures something to decrease in performance or outright break after a period of time. The purpose is to move consumers to upgrade to a newer model or spend hundreds or even thousands to fix the model they already have. If you haven't seen my video on planned obsolescence, check it out. Anyway, this is one way car companies are able to hide the real cost of a car. So let's say you're an engineer. All you have to do is engineer a few key components to fail in 5 years, and just after the warranty expires. This allows car makers to sell their cars for less because they know they'll get the big bucks when parts fail or get damaged in an accident. This ensures the other leg of their business, which is sales of replacement parts. Car makers control 73% of the replacement parts market, and they don't have plans of slowing down anytime soon. Believe it or not, automakers have even tried to use the Digital Millennium Copyright Act to stop owners from being able to modify their own cars. Imagine that. But there are people who want to challenge all of this. Take, for example, the Parts Act. It stands for Promoting Automotive Repair, Trade, and Sales, a bipartisan coalition proposed this legislation to deal with restrictive car design patents. Californian members of Congress, Republican Darrell Issa and Democrat Zoe Lofgren, proposed these reforms to address the problem. This act limits the length of time which a design patent could be enforced against aftermarket manufacture of cosmetic car parts. Under this bill, car makers would still be protected from competing generics for up to 14 years, but the intent of the act was to reduce design patents on collision repair parts to 30 months. And then, during that time, alternative suppliers could test and develop their own parts before bringing them to market. This act would prevent car makers from copying another company's design models, and it would encourage competition for the parts aftermarket. It sounds just and novel, but sadly, versions of it haven't gone very far. Even though this act was introduced in 2013, there's similar resolutions in effect in the United Kingdom, Australia, and the European Union. There are even more reasons why car manufacturers and repair costs have gone up in the past 30 years. Modern cars today are just so much more complex than the older ones. Now today, the average new car has 30,000 parts, and they have between 50 to 100 separate computers. These control everything from the engine management, acceleration, steering, brakes, airbags, air conditioning, locks, in-car displays, and even your infotainment system. Cars today use a massive 100 million lines of computer code. Put it into perspective, Android operating systems today are powered by just 12 million lines of code. It's only going to get more complicated in the future. And then there's self-driving cars. Once these become more mainstream in the market, car repair costs surely won't be going down anytime soon. Self-driving cars will require even more comprehensive computer power, which obviously means more cost to you. Now, it's true, older cars are definitely cheaper to buy and repair, but were they more reliable? Today in the U.S., the average car spends about 11.6 years on the road. But back in the 1950s and 60s, cars were scrapped when they were 7 or 8 years old. And this was well before they reached 100,000 miles for most people. Tires lasted about 10,000 miles and exhaust systems had to be replaced every 5 years. So older cars weren't as reliable as you might have thought. Really, the biggest difference between modern and older cars has to be their onboard computers. In the 1970s, the Environmental Protection Agency mandated standards for tailpipe emissions, so manufacturers had to use electronic controls to manage fuel injection systems that cleared up the air. Think of things like spark plug firing and fuel-air mixtures, but these systems also increased the cost by a lot. A Ford F-150 was $5,697 in 1980, which is equivalent to less than 20 grand in today's dollars. In the 1980s, the Society of Automotive Engineers created a universal system called Onboard Diagnostic System, also known as OBD2. This system became mandatory for manufacturers in 1996. With a new modern car, all you have to do is plug in the reader to a connection below the dashboard and you get a diagnostic code. And this code can be cross-referenced with a handbook of codes to see what it means to then fix your car. When the computers in modern cars start to fail, it'll be very tricky and expensive to diagnose and then fix them. Electronics don't like heat. The car interior is like a heat sink during the summer, especially if you live in the southern U.S. In the south, ambient car temperatures of a car parked in a hot summer sun can reach 130 to 170 degrees Fahrenheit for extended periods of time. So let's say you decide to park your car at the airport. When you finally return, it's like a sauna inside, and your onboard computer is completely busted because of it. Now you have to take it to a repair shop, and that will not be cheap. A plug-in hybrid, or PHEV, is a hybrid car with a combustion engine and an electric motor, but with a larger battery pack than a conventional hybrid. The advantage is it can run for longer on pure electric power alone. A plug-in hybrid car runs on electric power until the battery is almost depleted. Then the vehicle automatically switches over to the combustion engine. In general, most PHEVs dry up after about 20 miles on an average day or 30 miles on a good day. Some of the latest PHEVs have an official pure electric range of more than 50 miles. Today, the top 3 PHEVs in Europe are the Volvo XC40, the Peugeot 3008, and the BMW 3 Series. But recently, there's been a huge controversy surrounding the PHEV. Greenpeace UK even went so far as calling them a wolf in sheep's clothing. It turns out that the CO2 emissions from PHEVs are more than 2.5 times higher than what is stated in the official test results. Official tests showed that these vehicles emitted 1.55 ounces or 44 grams of CO2 per kilometer. But in reality, the average PHEV emits around 4.12 ounces or 117 grams. To put that in perspective, A new PHEV would emit about 28 tons of carbon dioxide over its lifetime. Compare that to a gasoline car, which emits about 39 tons, and a diesel car, which emits 41. By those numbers, PHEVs are more environmentally friendly. But nevertheless, it doesn't justify car makers from underreporting the true levels. The European Federation of Transport and Environment, or TNE, is a non-profit organization that campaigns for cleaner transportation. They say that Europe is sleepwalking towards another Dieselgate. Dieselgate was a scandal back in 2015 when Volkswagen was exposed for cheating emissions tests. So what's the basis for TNE's conclusion? Well, they tested 3 of the top-selling PHEVs under real-world conditions, specifically the BMW X5, the Volvo XC60, and the Mitsubishi Outlander. They found that CO2 emissions were between 28 and 89% higher than what the manufacturers claimed themselves. Driving in battery charging mode instead of full battery significantly increased emissions. And on an empty battery, the vehicles could only drive 6 to 14 miles before going over their official CO2s per mile claim. T&E called the PHEVs fake electric cars. They said they were built for lab tests and tax breaks, but not real driving. The test showed that even in optimal condition, full battery, the vehicles polluted more than was advertised. So if you were to take your PHEV on the road but forgot to charge the battery before you left, it may switch to the fossil fuel powered motor. If you accelerate too quickly, it may switch to the fossil fuel powered motor. And if you turn on your air conditioner as you're driving, you guessed it may switch to the fossil fuel powered motor. Carbon emissions could go off the charts unless you drive your PHEV as softly and slowly as you can. But not everybody is siding with T&E on this research. Take, for example, the European Automotive Manufacturers Association, or ACEA. This is a trade body that represents Europe's car makers. They say that the T&E's testing methods weren't representative of the typical use of plug-in hybrids. Of course, these people are involved in the manufacturing of the hybrid, so I'd take what they say with a grain of salt. Now, they say PHEVs are intended to be driven in full electric mode over short daily trips. They believe that CO2 emissions of PHEVs depend on how they are being used by the driver, which obviously isn't something the car makers can control. Recent headlines dubbed the plug-in hybrid as the hated pariah. If the PHEV does have some positive benefits, why has it become so hated by so many people? Well, one of the factors is that some big fleet operators exploited tax exemption rules by buying PHEVs. But then they didn't force their drivers to drive them sensibly. Here's the thing. These companies' car drivers don't pay for their own gas, so they have no real incentive to plug in the vehicles. After all, why bother charging the car if the company will pay for your gas? Because of this, lots of corporate-owned, tax-funded PHEVs consume more fuel than the combustion engine cars they replace. The irony and the futility. Now the companies could address this by imposing the rules or geofencing, but that hasn't happened, at least not yet. If you thought that was bad, there are even more deceptive PHEV claims that have been circulating recently. One research found that some popular PHEVs had as little as a third of the fuel economy advertised in official tests. These findings were based on tests that were done on 22 vehicles, including BMW, Mercedes-Benz, Mitsubishi, Volkswagen, and Volvo. On average, they burned 61% more fuel than in the official tests. Wondering which PHEV performed the worst? It was the BMW X5 plug-in hybrid SUV. It had a whopping 72% efficiency difference. That means paying $870 more than expected in gas costs each year. And that extra fuel burned would mean higher CO2 emissions. Even the environmental benefits of PHEVs are controversial. The car industry argues that they are a crucial stepping stone to help transition consumers to fully electric cars. But some environmental advocates argue that PHEVs can actually be less green than cars without a battery if they are not regularly recharged. By law, cars sold in Europe must be tested according to the Worldwide Harmonized Light Vehicle Test Procedure, or WLTP. But many argue that these do not reflect real-world driving conditions. Some have even gone so far to say that the official fuel economy emission tests are a crucial distortion of reality. But there's another side to all of this. They say the European advocacy group, whose goal was to end the use of liquid fuels in vehicles, circulated this big fat myth that PHEVs don't pollute more than regular cars. In a nutshell, they argue that in the U.S., automakers don't make pollution or mile per gallon claims. They only publish the EPA test results. Talk about a technicality. Sometimes automakers will try to predict efficiency or emissions based on EPA format testing. But it's really only the EPA that rates U.S. model vehicles for emissions and efficiency. It's true some automakers have cheated on MPG-related issues in the past for financial gain. But for U.S. vehicles, automakers don't advertise any efficiency or emissions claims other than what the EPA's testing mandate finds. They do acknowledge one truth, though. They say that the way alternative fuel additives view how PHEVs operate is flawed. Gas-powered cars require catalytic converters so they can lower polluting emissions. All these converters need to be hot to function properly. PHEV opponents say that since the PHEV's engine cycles on and off, the converters are never properly heated, so emissions are much higher than what was claimed. But they say that hybrids like the Prius have heat capture technology to warm the engines and catalytic converters more efficiently and quickly than conventional vehicles. This heat is stored, and so a few engine cycles on a short trip don't negatively impact the converters on a Prius. And Prius earns the same 10/10 EPA smog ratings as a Chevy Bolt EV. The biggest problems that some have with this myth is that it isn't logical. Let's say a driver of a RAV4 Prime covers 40 miles on a daily commute and only uses electricity. There'd be zero tailpipe emissions. But another RAV4 Prime daily covers 60 miles and uses a cold engine for part of the trip. Which is the emission standard based on? On 20 miles of gas operation? The chief executive of the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders, Mike Hawes, also described the T&E test as flawed, and that it relied on figures from a testing regime that was no longer being used. So are plug-in hybrids doomed to fail, or are they the cars of the future? Well, you may be surprised to learn that plug-in hybrids are actually quite popular, at least in Europe. PHEVs are an important part of car makers' strategy to cut their average CO2 emissions and steer clear of steep fines. Take Volkswagen and Jaguar Land Rover, for example. Jaguar Land Rover is the UK's largest automotive employers, and both these companies are among the car makers who have been told to pay out millions of dollars for breaching EU targets in 2020. At least for these companies, PHEVs are one way to go. Did you know that the UK government wants to stop sales of all new hybrid, diesel, and gasoline cars and vans by the year 2035 or sooner? But plug-in hybrids might end up being exempt from that ban. Shortly after the Volkswagen emissions cheating scandal, the European Union passed tougher car emissions regulations. But there just isn't enough support for the industry today. Automakers keep reducing manufacturer repair time. Auto technicians are expected to diagnose and fix problems in a very tight time frame, and it's only getting tighter. This flat rate discourages experienced auto technicians from using their time to coach recent graduates instead. Less coaches mean less training. Less training means less people who are motivated to learn the job hands-on, which means less mechanics, thereby increasing repair and maintenance costs. But now you tell me, have you noticed your car maintenance costs going up in the past few years? Please share your experience by commenting below. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. Thanks for your support.